I'm too old to give you babies, I said, because apparently humiliation had decided to wear a tuxedo and attend the most expensive gala in Manhattan. Grant Calloway stood in front of me beneath a ceiling of falling snow, one knee still pressed to the stone balcony, a black velvet ring box open in his hand. Behind him, the city glittered 40 floors below, all silver windows and yellow lights, as if New York itself had paused to watch me ruin the most impossible proposal of the year. Grant did not blink. That was the terrifying thing about him. The founder and CEO of Calloway Astor Group could silence a boardroom with one glance, close a billion-dollar deal before lunch, and make grown alphas reconsider their entire personalities just by adjusting his cufflinks. Yet now he was looking at me like I had said something that hurt. Not offended him. Hurt him. I folded my arms across my chest, partly to protect myself and partly because my hands were shaking. You need an heir, I continued. Someone young. Someone polished. Someone who doesn't make a suspicious noise every time he stands up too fast. Grant rose slowly, towering over me in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. His expression remained calm, but the cedarwood note of his scent warmed in the cold air. Julian, he said. Just my name. Low. Careful. Somehow worse than anger. I laughed because I had spent most of my adult life using humor as emotional duct tape. I'm 41, Grant. In Omega years, society thinks I should be knitting scarves and giving unsolicited advice to younger people at brunch. His jaw tightened. I didn't ask society. No, you asked me to marry you in the middle of your company's anniversary gala. I gestured toward the ballroom doors, where several hundred guests were pretending not to stare through the glass. That is practically asking society with champagne service. Grant closed the ring box, but he did not put it away. I didn't ask you for children. His voice was quieter now. I asked you to marry me. My heart stumbled. One stupid, hopeful beat. I crushed it immediately. Hope had terrible judgment where Grant Calloway was concerned. Then why me? I asked. You could marry anyone. His eyes held mine. Blue-gray. Steady. Impossible to read. No, he said. I couldn't. Before I could answer, the balcony door swung open. Richard Calloway stepped outside wearing the satisfied smile of a man who had never once been told to mind his own business. Grant's uncle, chairman of the board, professional destroyer of private moments. Behind him came two photographers and a young Omega in a white designer suit. Richard raised his champagne glass. There you are, he announced. Everyone is waiting for the engagement announcement. I looked at Grant, then at the beautiful stranger beside Richard. Young, elegant, perfect. Of course. The hopeful beat in my chest disappeared so fast, it was almost impressive. I stepped back before Grant could reach for me. Congratulations, I whispered. Then I walked past him, through the ballroom, and into the elevator without looking back. The doors nearly closed before I saw Grant still standing on the balcony, the ring box clenched in his hand, his entire empire glowing behind him like something he had built for a reason no one had bothered to explain to me. 12 years earlier, Grant Calloway had owned exactly 3 shirts, 1 cracked laptop, and enough pride to pretend he was not freezing. I found him at 2 in the morning in a 24-hour diner in Queens, sitting alone beneath a flickering light with a cup of coffee he had stopped drinking an hour earlier. He was 23 then, all sharp cheekbones, exhausted eyes, and expensive manners trapped inside a borrowed coat. I had just finished cataloging a private collection for a museum and wanted nothing except pancakes and silence. Instead, I sat across from the saddest alpha in New York. You know they refill the coffee for free, I told him. He looked at the cup as if it had personally betrayed him. I am aware. Then you should let them. You look like you are trying to survive on dignity. His mouth almost moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to encourage me. The waitress brought my pancakes, and I pushed half the plate toward him. Grant stared at it. I did not ask for food. Good. I hate sharing with people who ask. That earned me the smallest laugh. It was quiet and surprised, like he had forgotten he could make that sound. Over the next hour, the story came out in pieces. His family had planned his future before he could choose his own tie. A corporate position, a strategic mating, an Omega from a family with the right name and the right connections. Grant had refused. His uncle had called him ungrateful. His father had frozen his accounts. By midnight, Grant Calloway had gone from heir to inconvenience. So what now? I asked. He opened the cracked laptop and showed me a business plan so ambitious it bordered on delusion. Renewable infrastructure, ethical property development, workplace protections for Omegas, and enough financial projections to make my eyes blur. It was brilliant. It was also unreadable. You wrote this like you were threatening the bank, I said. I am requesting funding. Exactly. Less hostage negotiation. More human sentences. We worked until sunrise. I reorganized his proposal, corrected his presentation, and removed the phrase aggressive market domination from the opening paragraph. When the diner windows turned pale gold, Grant looked at the finished plan as if I had handed him a map out of a locked room. Why are you helping me? He asked. I shrugged and slid my scarf across the table because he was still pretending not to shiver. Because somebody should. He looked down at the scarf, then back at me. How do I repay you? I smiled, tired enough to be careless. Build an empire. Then buy me dinner. I meant it as a joke. Grant did not laugh. He folded the scarf carefully around his neck and held my gaze with an intensity that made the noisy diner seem strangely still. All right, he said. I will. By the time the elevator reached the 42nd floor, I had convinced myself that remembering the diner meant nothing. Memory was not destiny. It was merely the brain reopening an old file at the worst possible moment. The doors parted onto the executive level of Callaway Astor Group, where every surface gleamed and every employee moved with the focused terror of people who knew their chief executive officer could detect an incorrect decimal from across the room. I adjusted my tie and followed Grant toward the archive wing. After leaving the gala, I had planned to resign before sunrise. Instead, his legal department had reminded me that I was under contract for 3 weeks to authenticate the company records before the new trust launched. Apparently, heartbreak did not qualify as a professional emergency. Grant walked several feet ahead of me, silent and perfectly composed. He had not mentioned the proposal, Richard, or the young Omega in white. I hated how relieved I felt. I hated even more that I noticed he was wearing the silver watch I had helped him buy at a thrift store 12 years earlier. The band had been replaced, but the scratched face was unmistakable. You kept that? I asked before common sense could intervene. Grant glanced at his wrist. It still works. Of course. That was Grant. He could turn sentiment into inventory management. The archive occupied an entire floor behind climate-controlled glass. Inside were contracts, architectural plans, early payroll records, and every policy revision since the company began. I started with the employee protection files. 10 minutes later, I stopped breathing. The first document guaranteed paid leave during heat-related medical emergencies. The second prohibited mating status from affecting promotion decisions. The third funded private legal assistance for Omegas escaping coercive family arrangements. Each policy had been adopted years before similar protections became common. I looked through the glass wall at Grant. He stood outside speaking with 3 department heads, cold and efficient, one hand in his pocket. The same hand that had once gripped a chipped diner mug while he told me his family wanted to choose his entire life. These policies, I said when he entered, they started with you. They started with a problem. That is not an answer. Grant came closer and placed a paper cup beside my laptop. Cinnamon. No sugar. Exactly how I drank coffee when I was tired. You remembered that too, I said. His gaze settled on mine. I remember most things about you. My heart attempted something reckless. I ignored it. Did Richard approve these protections? No. Did your board? Eventually. Grant, did you build half this company around arguments we had in that diner? Something softened in his expression, then vanished. Not half. I waited. He opened a folder and pointed to a clause requiring equal parental leave for every secondary gender. That one came from the conversation outside the museum. Another page. Medical privacy protections. That came from the clinic story you told me. A third. Emergency housing grants. That came from you saying freedom was useless without somewhere safe to go. The room suddenly felt too small. His empire was no longer steel and glass. It was a collection of things I had once said and forgotten. Grant had remembered every word. Then I noticed the file he had tried to cover with his hand. My name was printed across the tab. Julian Mercer. Confidential. Grant closed the confidential file before I could touch it. That is not part of the archive review, he said, which was exactly the sort of sentence guaranteed to make me want to steal it. My name is on the tab. I am aware. Excellent. I was worried your legendary attention to detail had abandoned you. His expression did not change, but the cedarwood note in his scent sharpened. He placed the file inside a locked drawer and handed me my coat. We have to leave. Snow had buried nearly 8 inches of Manhattan while we worked, turning the streets below into white ribbons of stalled traffic. Our scheduled flight to Boston had been canceled, but Grant still needed to inspect documents at a Callaway Astor property outside the city before the trust meeting. His solution was a private car, a hotel near the site, and the calm certainty that weather obeyed corporate authority. 2 hours later, the storm proved otherwise. The highway closed behind us. Our driver could go no farther, and the only hotel with power had one available suite. Of course it does, I muttered as the clerk handed Grant a single key card. The universe has the subtlety of a daytime soap opera. The suite had 2 rooms separated by a wide wooden door, which felt manageable until warmth spread beneath my collar and settled heavily along my spine. I stopped beside the window. My pulse fluttered. My skin felt too sensitive beneath my shirt. No, not now. I reached into my bag for my suppressant bottle and froze. The label was mine, but the tablets inside were the wrong color. Grant noticed immediately. Julian, I think someone switched my medication. His entire body went still. Not panic. Control. Ruthless, immediate control. He called the hotel physician, ordered sealed medication from a nearby clinic, and opened every window despite the freezing air. Then he stepped into the adjoining room. Lock the door behind me, he said. Grant, this could take hours. Then it takes hours. His scent had deepened, cedarwood warmed by something restless, but he kept 12 feet between us. I hated that I noticed the distance. I hated that it made me feel safer. You do not have to treat me like a dangerous package, I said, attempting humor because fear had started pressing against my ribs. Grant looked at me with an expression so gentle it almost undid me. I am not protecting myself from you. He entered the other room and closed the door. A moment later, his voice came through the wood. Your body recognizing mine does not create an obligation. You do not owe me closeness. You do not owe me comfort. You do not owe me anything. I sat on the carpet with my back against the door, holding a glass of cold water between both hands. You always sound like a legal document when you are worried. Silence. Then, quietly, I am worried. The admission landed harder than any grand declaration could have. For the next hour, Grant stayed on the other side of the door, talking about ordinary things to keep me calm. The diner, my museum work, the terrible tie I had worn to our second meeting. He remembered its color. He remembered the coffee stain on my sleeve. He remembered everything. When the physician finally arrived, I opened the door and found Grant seated against the opposite wall, 2 scent blockers fastened at his throat, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked exhausted. He also looked relieved. That was when I understood the dangerous truth. Grant had never been afraid of losing control over me. He had been afraid I would believe he wanted to. The medication worked by sunrise, leaving me tired, embarrassed, and deeply annoyed by the fact that Grant had behaved like a decent man when I desperately needed him to be easier to dislike. He had slept in a chair near the suite entrance, still wearing his dress shirt, with 1 scent blocker crooked at his throat. I told myself I noticed only because professional archivists were trained to observe details. This was a lie. By noon, the highway reopened, and we reached the Callaway Astor Records facility outside Boston, a low brick building surrounded by snow-covered fields and enough security cameras to make a federal courthouse feel casual. Grant received an urgent call from the board before we entered the restricted archive. Richard scheduled a vote, he said, checking his phone. I have to join remotely. Go defend your kingdom, I replied. I will try not to uncover any more evidence that you secretly built it out of my opinions. His gaze lingered on me. Julian, do not open anything marked personal. Naturally, that became the first thing I wanted to do. I behaved for almost 40 minutes. Then I found the original corporate charter inside a fireproof cabinet. The document should have contained routine language about ownership, voting rights, and executive authority. Instead, one section carried a handwritten label in Grant's precise script. The Mercer Clause. My stomach dropped. I read it once, then twice. The clause prevented any shareholder, relative, or board member from using marriage, mating, fertility, or succession demands to control the founder's personal decisions. If anyone attempted it, Grant could transfer his voting power into an independent employee trust. The protection had been written 12 years earlier, before the company owned a single office. Before Grant had money. Before he had power. Before he had any reason to believe I would ever see him again. Behind the charter sat a narrow black box tied with faded blue ribbon. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Every envelope carried my name. None had stamps. I should have stopped. Privacy was not a difficult concept. Unfortunately, neither was curiosity, and mine had just become a full-time criminal. I opened the oldest letter. Grant had written it 3 weeks after our night at the diner. He described his first investor meeting, the terrible coffee, and the scarf I had given him. The next letter was written after the company hired its first employee, another after its first profitable year. Every milestone came with words he had never sent. I almost called you today. I saw your museum interview. You looked happy, so I stayed away. I will not return while my family can still turn my life into your cage. I sat down on the archive floor because my knees had forgotten their purpose. The final envelope was dated 6 months earlier. Inside was 1 page. I have enough now. Enough power to protect his freedom. Enough distance from my family to offer him a choice without consequences. I only need the courage to ask. The archive door opened behind me. Grant stood there with his phone still in his hand. His eyes moved from the letters to my face, and all the color left his expression. You read them, he said. It was not anger. It was fear. I rose slowly, holding the final page between us. You kept writing to me for 12 years. Grant closed the door. The lock clicked softly. Yes. You wrote a clause into your company before your company even existed. Yes. My voice shook despite every effort to steady it. Grant, what exactly did you think would happen when you finally came back? He looked at me with the same impossible intensity he had worn in that diner. Only now there was an empire behind him and nowhere left to hide. I hoped, he said, that you might still choose me. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The archive hummed around us, climate controls whispering through the vents while snow pressed pale light against the narrow windows. Grant stood 10 feet away, but the distance felt carefully constructed, like every mile he had placed between us over 12 years had been compressed into that room. You hoped I would choose you, I repeated. My voice sounded strangely calm. After disappearing without a word, his eyes lowered to the letters scattered across the table. I did not disappear because I forgot you. That is not much comfort. I know. The answer came without defense. No polished explanation. No executive certainty. Just truth. Grant removed his watch and set it beside the oldest letter, exposing the faint mark where the band had rested for years. The night we met, you gave me food, your time, your savings, and a plan I could actually present without frightening every investor in New York. Your original draft used the phrase total market conquest. You removed it. Humanity owes me a debt. His mouth softened, but the almost smile vanished quickly. You were the first person who helped me without asking what my family could give you in return. I loved you before I understood that was what it was. My heart missed a step, then another. I held the final letter tighter. You could have told me. With what? He asked. A borrowed coat, a frozen bank account, a family prepared to investigate anyone I cared about. He moved 1 step closer, then stopped. You once told me that the most beautiful cage was still a cage. I would not come back and offer you one. The words settled between us. He had not built his empire to impress me. He had built walls around my right to say no. That realization should have made everything simple. Instead, fear rose inside me, old and practiced. You love a memory, I said. A 29-year-old Omega who fixed your business plan and made jokes over pancakes. I am not him anymore. Grant's gaze traveled over my face, not measuring age, not searching for what time had changed, simply seeing me. You still tap your thumb against your index finger when you are anxious. You still drink cinnamon coffee when you have not slept. You still make jokes when you are afraid someone might be kind to you. He came close enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, but he did not touch me. I know exactly who you are, Julian. My breath caught. For one dangerous moment, the room narrowed to his eyes, his voice, and the quiet space between us. Then I stepped back. What happens when love is not enough? I asked. What happens in 5 years, when the board wants succession? When your family wants a Callaway heir? When you look at me and realize you chose someone who might never give you that? Grant went still. Not angry. Wounded. Then I will want an heir, he said carefully. My chest tightened. He continued before I could turn away. And I will still want no one but you. We can adopt. We can foster. We can build a family in any way we choose. Or we can choose not to build one at all. His voice lowered. Children are not the price of being loved. I stared at him, unable to hide behind humor this time. Grant reached for the ring box in his pocket, then stopped himself. I will not ask again today, he said. Not while you are afraid. Somewhere beyond the archive walls, his board was deciding the future of his company. Grant did not look toward the phone. He looked only at me, as though my answer had always mattered more than the empire waiting outside. The board meeting began at 4 o'clock in the main auditorium of Callaway Astor Group, with 300 shareholders in the room and thousands more watching online. I sat in the second row because Grant had asked me to stay close, though Richard had made it clear that my presence was considered a problem requiring expensive lawyers and carefully worded insults. Grant stood at the center of the stage beneath the company emblem, composed as ever, while Richard approached the podium with a smile that made my instincts whisper, "Run." Before we vote on executive leadership, Richard said, the shareholders deserve full transparency regarding the personal judgment of our chief executive officer. The screen behind him changed. My name appeared first, then my age, then pages from my private medical records. The room became painfully quiet. I stopped breathing. Richard spoke about fertility rates, succession plans, and what he called the future stability of the Callaway legacy. He never called me a person. I was a risk. A declining percentage. An unsuitable investment wearing a Navy suit. Grant turned toward the screen, and the cedarwood note of his scent sharpened so suddenly that several people shifted in their seats. Turn it off, he said. Richard ignored him. The reports indicate that Mr. Mercer is unlikely to produce a biological heir. My hands went cold. I had spent years learning how to carry that sentence without letting anyone see its weight. Richard placed it on a screen 40 feet wide. Grant stepped between me and the audience. This meeting is over. On the contrary, Richard replied. It has only become honest. A strange sweetness entered the air. Artificial. Heavy. Wrong. Grant froze. His shoulders tightened, and his breathing changed. Someone had activated a scent diffuser inside the ventilation system. The synthetic pheromones were designed to provoke an alpha response, to make Grant appear unstable in front of every camera in the room. Security moved toward the control panel while Grant lowered himself to one knee several feet away from me. He did not reach out. He did not come closer. His hands remained open at his sides. Julian, he said, his voice strained but careful. Tell me to leave, and I will. Every person in the auditorium was watching. Richard expected instinct to erase Grant's control. He expected fear to erase mine. I stood and walked to the edge of the stage. Grant's eyes followed me, but he stayed exactly where he was. May I help? I asked. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Only if you choose to. I offered my wrist. Nothing more. Grant leaned close enough to breathe in the natural scent at my pulse, grounding himself in something real instead of the chemicals flooding the room. He never touched me. Slowly, his shoulders relaxed. The cameras captured everything Richard had failed to understand. Grant's strength was not the absence of instinct. It was the choice he made in spite of it. Then I looked again at the medical records still displayed behind us. A date caught my attention. The report claimed I had visited a Callaway-owned fertility clinic 9 years earlier. I had never been there. I studied the physician's signature, the altered hormone results, and the corporate seal hidden at the bottom of the page. My humiliation turned cold and clear. Grant, I whispered, these records are not mine. Richard's smile disappeared. I faced the shareholders and pointed toward the screen. Someone did not merely steal my medical history. Someone changed it. For one long second, nobody moved. Then the room erupted into overlapping voices, flashing screens, and the frantic movement of lawyers suddenly discovering religion. Richard stepped away from the podium. This is a misunderstanding, he said. Grant rose beside me, calm returning to his face with terrifying speed. No, he replied. It is evidence. His legal counsel began tracing the altered files while security shut down the scent system and sealed the auditorium records. Within minutes, the truth appeared on the main screen. The clinic belonged to a private holding company controlled by Richard. The false report had been created years earlier, Not because anyone expected me to marry Grant then, but because Richard had learned my name from the first version of the corporate charter. He had known. All this time, he had known exactly why Grant built the Mercer Clause. Richard had tried to turn my body into a warning before Grant ever found the courage to return. You thought he would weaken you, Richard said, staring at Grant. You were building a global company around the memory of one Omega. Grant looked at me before answering. I was building a company where no one could do to another person what you just did to Julian. The shareholder vote remained scheduled, but Grant no longer seemed interested in saving his position. He walked to the podium and entered a security code. The Mercer Clause appeared behind him in bold letters. Effective immediately, he announced. I am transferring controlling voting power into the Callaway Astor Employee Trust. A wave of shocked whispers passed through the auditorium. I understood before most of them did. Grant was giving up the advantage that had made him untouchable. No family member would control the company again. Neither would he. You will lose the chair, one director warned. Possibly, Grant said. Your personal holdings will fall. Probably. You built this for 12 years. Grant turned toward me. Then it should be strong enough to survive without owning either of us. My vision blurred. I had spent weeks believing his empire was proof of ambition, then proof of obsession, then proof of love. I finally understood it was none of those things by itself. It was a door. He had spent 12 years making certain it could open from both sides. Richard was escorted from the stage to meet with investigators and company attorneys, still insisting the board would never accept the transfer. Grant did not watch him leave. He stepped down and stopped several feet away from me, giving me the same distance he always offered when my answer mattered. I am sorry, he said. For the records. For the stage. For every moment you were made to feel like your worth could be measured. I reached into his coat pocket before courage abandoned me and found the black velvet ring box. Grant stared as I opened it. You said you would not ask again while I was afraid. I reminded him. I remember. Good. Because I am still afraid. His expression fell, but I took the ring from the box and slid it onto my finger. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. Grant remembered everything. I am afraid, I continued, and I am choosing you anyway. The entire auditorium disappeared from my awareness. Grant looked at the ring, then at me, as if hope was something too fragile to approach quickly. Julian, he whispered. I smiled through tears. You built the exit, Grant. Now take me home. 3 months later, Grant married me in the same diner where I had once given him half a plate of pancakes and a scarf he still refused to replace. The place had been renovated, but Grant had insisted on keeping the old counter, the faded booths, and the light above our original table that flickered whenever the kitchen used too much power. It has character, he said. It has an electrical problem, I replied. He smiled anyway. There were no reporters, no shareholders, and no ballroom filled with strangers measuring my value. Only friends, trusted employees, and the waitress who had served us 12 years earlier. She cried before I did, which felt unfair because I had practiced being emotionally dignified in the mirror for an entire week. Grant wore a dark blue suit and the silver watch from the thrift store. I wore the ring I had taken from his pocket in front of 300 shareholders. When the officiant asked whether I chose him freely, Grant looked at me with the same careful stillness he always carried when my answer mattered. I do, I said. His breath left him softly, as though part of him had been waiting 12 years to believe those 2 words. Our bond ceremony happened later, privately, and without spectacle. There were no expectations, no talk of heirs, and no promises built around what my body might or might not do. Grant asked before every step. I answered without fear. For the first time in my life, commitment did not feel like a door closing. It felt like walking through one that had always been held open. The employee trust approved Grant as chief executive officer again, though he now answered to elected representatives instead of the Callaway family. Richard faced criminal and civil investigations, while the clinic records were reviewed for other victims. Grant and I used part of our settlement to establish the Mercer Freedom Foundation, offering medical advocacy, emergency housing, and legal support to Omegas who had been judged, controlled, or discarded because of age or fertility. 6 months after the wedding, I began feeling sick every morning. I blamed stress, then bad coffee, then a suspicious breakfast sandwich from a train station. Grant blamed himself for buying the sandwich and nearly ordered an internal review of the entire cafe. My doctor listened patiently before requesting an ultrasound. I lay on the examination table while Grant sat beside me, holding my hand as if it were the only stable object in the room. The doctor studied the screen, smiled, and turned toward us. "Mr. Mercer, I am seeing 2 heartbeats." Silence. Complete silence. Grant, who could address thousands of investors without notes, forgot every word in the English language. I stared at the screen until the 2 tiny rhythms blurred behind my tears. "Twins," I whispered. "Twins," the doctor confirmed. Grant did not look at the monitor first. He looked at me. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice unsteady. That question broke me more completely than the news. "Not can you do this? Not what does this mean for the company? Not finally. Just are you happy?" I nodded and laughed through my tears. Terrified. Overwhelmed. Probably going to demand pancakes at 2 in the morning. But yes. Grant lowered his forehead to my hand and closed his eyes. "Then I am happy too." Outside the clinic windows, Manhattan stretched beneath a bright winter sky. Somewhere among those towers stood the empire Grant had built when he believed power was the only way to protect love. But as I watched 2 heartbeats flicker on the screen, I understood that the empire had never been the ending. It was only the long road that brought him back to a diner, a promise, and the family we had chosen before we knew it was waiting for us.